Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Which is Volunteer Management Toolkit. In today's webinar we will go through and we'll talk about the toolkit that is now available on Agency Zone as well as the volunteer program inventory on there as well. I just want to give you a little bit of background information about myself before we get started. My name is Rashandra, and I'm an AmeriCorps Vista with Second Harvest Heartland. I started back in February of 2013, and my service will be completed in February of this year. So I was right on in 2013 to work on a couple of things. The first step was to create a needs assessment that can be used by our partner agencies that will serve as an inventory to go through and really assess their volunteer program, help them figure out what things they already had, what things they didn't have, and new things they wanted to implement in order to increase capacity in volunteers. The next step was to create a volunteer management toolkit, which you can look over here and see the cover of it. And this toolkit goes through and talks about many topics such as risk management, staffing, recruitment, orientation and training, and recognition, to name a few. It goes through and gives you information on best practices and all those topics, as well as provides resources like templates, examples, other great information, things that you can have in order to implement new changes in your volunteer program. So I wanted to get started and kind of show you where the needs assessment and toolkit is located. If you go over to here, this is our Second Harvest Heartland home screen. So all of you may be familiar with twoharvest.org. And I started here because I know that most people probably get to Agency Zone by using this website. So if you go over here and you click on the right side, you click on the Agency Zone website. And then once you're here, the Volunteer Toolkit is located in the Resources section. So you click on Resources and you click on Volunteer Toolkit. And there it is. The Volunteer Management Toolkit kind of gives you an overview. So you come to the page, it gives you an overview why we created this and designed it. The Volunteer Program Inventory lays right here. That's clickable. And it kind of talks about the toolkit as an introductory step to the resource guide. We do recommend that you complete the volunteer program inventory / needs assessment. You'll hear me referring to both of the terms during this webinar. But complete that before you dive into the toolkit. I think that if you dive into the toolkit without completing that first, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So today I'm going to open up the volunteer program inventory / needs assessment, and we're going to go through there and kind of walk through what each section of the needs assessment talks about, and then we're going to go back and forth. So you'll be seeing me switch screens a lot. I'll go back to the toolkit and show you how you can use the toolkit to work on some of those things, and then at the end I'll also be talking about some capacity building efforts you can begin to take in your volunteer program to improve some of those things. So let's go ahead and click on the volunteer program inventory and open that up. So as you see over here, the volunteer program inventory is really going through and walking you through a list of statements that are separated in sections. Each section is separated based on best practices or things that are important to a volunteer program. So I gathered that information by talking to other leaders of volunteers and really trying to figure out what are all the important steps that you need to make sure you're practicing in a volunteer program in order for you to serve your volunteers in the best way. So, like I said, the point of this inventory is to help you identify the process, systems, and templates that you'd like to create, as well as point out existing components in need of refinement. The ultimate goal is to produce new or refined assets that expand your organization's capacity to work with volunteers. So let's get started. Organizational support is the first section. It goes through, lists your statements. For example, the first one is asking if you provide orientation for new paid staff about why and how volunteers are involved. It asks you to go through, you say, yes, my organization does this, no we don't, we somewhat do this, we don't, no, or it doesn't apply to my organization. So after you do that, on the right side over here, it asks you to prioritize them. So 1 being the top priority and 5 in the low priority. The reason why this is important, because let's say you don't do this at all, but it's not really a priority of yours. You decide that there are other things that come before that. And that's why it's good to know the priority, especially if you're going to work with your agency account specialist, it's important for them to understand what it is that you would like to improve in your volunteer program. I will say this. I will say to go through the entire volunteer program inventory by just answering, if it already exists in your organization, so the yes, no, somewhat, don't know, or not applicable. Go do that first and fill the whole thing out. Then you can go back to the top and prioritize them. Otherwise, it can get a little bit confusing about what you want to work on. You'll also be able to notice that once you get through filling the whole thing out, it's clear what you need to prioritize and what's a low priority. So if you're filling out the sections and you realize you have everything in policies and procedures, then you can definitely cross out your list that's not something you need to work on. So let's get started with organizational support. So you've gone through and you fill this out. I want to show you how it's connected with the toolkit. So section 1 right here talks about organizational support. So we'll get that open and we'll scroll down. So section 1, organizational support, really focuses on giving you some of those myths that organizations may have about why they don't want to use volunteers, and really going through and debunking those myths. So if you're the leader of volunteers and you're kind of the spokesperson for your volunteers and you're trying to figure out what are some great talking points you can give to your leadership staff at your organization or board members to really make them see why volunteers are important and why it's important to invest time into them, then this section will definitely help you out with that. It also provides a great resource, this Mission Possible, and it talks about how executive directors can maximize the power of volunteers. This is a MAVA document, and you may hear me say MAVA a lot. MAVA, when I say MAVA, I refer to Minnesota's Association of Volunteer Administration. So they're this organization that allows you to pay for membership to join them, and it's all these volunteer managers who join this organization. They have great professional development courses. They have webinars that they can offer you, and gives you a lot of information about what it is to be a volunteer manager, and you kind of just have that support. So this document is from them. I'm not going to click on any of the documents in the resources section for this webinar, but if you do have the time, I really do recommend that you go through the entire toolkit and you look at each section and review the resources and templates and documents I have provided for you. So this document, like I said, this how executive directors can maximize the power of volunteers. It's a great document to give you talking points as well. So it provides more examples of why it's important to make smart investments in your volunteer program. So that's organizational support. So if you go back to the volunteer program inventory, we'll go on to the next section. And before I do that, so let's say you decide in organizational support, you want to work on that and you want to start making efforts to build capacity in that area. Some of the activities you can do is, for example, organize staff effort to identify expanded roles for volunteers in the organization. So if your organization is only using volunteers in the food shelf and nowhere else, maybe it's important that you sit your staff down and really talk about what are some other areas we can use volunteers around here to help us out with our day-to-day operations. So that's definitely a first step in capacity building. The next section talks about staffing. Staffing is really focused on, who do you have that's your leader of volunteers? Do you have someone where volunteers can go to if they have a problem, if they have questions? It's really important to have a point person there. So if you go back to the toolkit, section 4 is the staffing section. And section 4 talks about identifying a leader and defining expectations. So when it talks about identifying a leader, it's really looking at who are you going to have to lead your volunteers. It doesn't necessarily have to be a paid staff member, full-time or part-time. It could be another volunteer that you decide to put in charge of other volunteers. It also talks about defining expectations. And the reason why this goes great together is because it really does talk about that scenario of making a staff member who probably has another full-time job as a volunteer manager and being a leader of volunteers. It's really important to define those expectations of what you want this volunteer coordinator to do. Some people are able to do it part-time, but others, the tasks are just too much for them to be able to do that as a part-time gig, and maybe they'll have to do it full-time. So it's really important, and it depends on how many volunteers you have as well, for you to sit down and decide, is this something that, you know, another staff member can do part-time, or do we need a full-time person to do this type of work? So if you wanted to look at capacity building efforts, and I'm sorry, it has a great resource down here, the importance of volunteer supervision, that you can go to. If you wanted to do some capacity building efforts, definitely it would be to sit down with staff in your organization and pinpoint a staff person and decide, you know, is this going to be a paid position? Is this going to be a volunteer position? And then begin your recruitment efforts and make sure that you can find a volunteer leader. If you can't go outside the organization and get a volunteer leader, another thing would be to kind of develop a sustainability plan for staff in volunteer management and training materials. So as I mentioned before, MAVA is a membership. They offer professional development for staff members who you may decide, you know, this person is going to work with our volunteers. They offer a lot of trainings, professional development for them to go to and learn about volunteer management. So if you decide that you want to just invest in a staff person who's already there to work with your volunteers, do make sure that that person is well trained in order to take on that role, because it's not a great feeling for the staff person or the volunteers if you have somebody in that position who doesn't really know how to work with volunteers. So I think that that's something to really work on. So that's staffing.
So as you continue to scroll down, our next section would be policies and procedures and the needs assessment. So really this policies and procedures really focuses. So it has a checklist, which is something that I noticed throughout this year of working with some of our partners, is that we do have a lot of situations where our clients are being I really did focus a lot, too, on the clients in your volunteer program. It's important that you have some type of policy in place. And some of those policies that state that clients can volunteer, but they must come for food on different days and on days when they're not volunteering. So this section just kind of walks you through for client and volunteer involved. You do have a copy to look at. You know, it is here for you if you wanted to just insert your organization's name and use this policy. But most of all, I just wanted to give you an example of what a policy would look like and what the procedures are that we follow here at Second Harvest Heartland, so you can decide for yourself what you want to do with it. So this is definitely a good template that I have offered you, and there are many other resources in this section for policies and procedures. Volunteer handbook is kind of the same along the same line. I provided an example from Second Harvest Heartland. They do a really good job in the volunteer handbook of laying out their key policies and 3 to 4 sentences about each policy for their volunteers. And again, volunteer handbooks, volunteers get to keep these things, so it's nice to have those there. PRISM and Neighbors Inc. was volunteer coordinator, but for purposes of their policy here, and they put step-by-step on the actions. If they forget what the procedure is, it's always there for them to go back to it. If you do have really good places to start, oftentimes if you have those at your organization, it can be used for volunteers as well. So it will require little changes that need to be made, and oftentimes you can just kind of copy and paste that and work on changing things as they need to be. And again, if anyone is having any trouble hearing me, you can type in your organization, have a need. Do you assess your thing in recruitment as well? Some ways, schools, corporations, of course, hands-on Twin Cities and volunteer match. Hands-on Twin Cities is a nonprofit organization committed to promoting and facilitating meaningful volunteer opportunities. So you can definitely become an affiliate partner with them and be able to log on there and post some of your volunteer opportunities. Another thing is Volunteer Match. I think Volunteer Match is great. They have this cool feature where it's fighting hunger together, where as a volunteer, if I were to log onto their website, I can pick which one I want to volunteer at. So that's definitely a great feature. It goes a little bit into social media and how some strategies can be made. It does have a YouTube video that you can talk about Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to make sure that you are actively recruiting extra volunteers to replace or make sure that you have somebody in place after volunteers do leave. Have a lot of resources for recruitment. I have a recruitment plan that lays out here, and this is a Marvel resource, and it has an entire how to sit down and plan for recruitment. It has about information about engaging youth, which I think is a great website. A lot of our partners do talk about being able to reach out to those different generations. So it has everything really good on there. And if you were going to work on capacity building and recruitment, some of the things that you can do is develop a volunteer recruitment plan. So again, there's a template right on here that you can take a look at. Design recruitment materials and work on building key relationships in the community to raise awareness about your organization and the services that you do provide. So those are all great ways to work on recruitment. Steps to help protect the organization, but you're also helping screening your volunteers. How are you interviewing them? So when you go to the toolkit, it talks about job descriptions, screening procedures. So we're going to click on here. Descriptions are really important. So developing volunteer position descriptions is definitely that first step in recruitment. It forces you to be clear and specific about So in this section, it does talk about low level, and I just want to scroll down and show you this chart that for some position descriptions, you may not need to do background checks. For those positions that are working more directly with clients, for example, the first one, which is the unsupervised contact with a vulnerable client, that may be things like homebound delivery of meals where you're not directly with them, but they do have contact with clients. We do want to make sure that we are doing more of a high-risk screening process with them. So we want to do reference checks and background checks, and we want to do applications and definitely interviews with them. As you scroll down, it does talk about elements of an interview. So if you aren't doing any interviewing, in my resources section, it offers interview questions that you can click on, and it gives it. So that means that if you aren't doing an application right now, or you are not doing any interviewing or screening, to go ahead and get some of those practices in place. It definitely helps with risk management. Next in our needs assessment, it talks so orientation and everybody else. So it continues to go through and talk about things that are important, making sure you're greeting the volunteer as they arrive, making sure that physical orientation, I think, is really important. If you have a special place for them to hang their coats or put their purses, all these things are important to let them know upon their arrival on their first day at your organization. So if you have a lot of volunteers who are just working in the food shelf and they want to learn about other areas in your organization, it would be beneficial to sit down and see if there are any other training opportunities where they can learn how to do other things at your organization besides just working in the food shelf. The next area in the needs assessment focuses on data and how I track volunteer data and how to select a volunteer manager. So briefly here, it has a lot of information, and it's very detailed information, complicated, but it is very necessary to know all the steps that you need to take, key features. So this is a amazing chart to you. Anything right now, I think it's beneficial to take a look into some of the programs that they have out there. Some of these are free, like Volunteer Spot does offer a free way to track your volunteers. Also, Excel documents can work as well if you have a good system that's working. As long as you're able to track that volunteer information, I think it's really helpful. work of your volunteers. Things that are offered on a budget, simple things that you can do, of course, saying thank you, writing them a letter of recommendation, listing them in training of other staff and volunteers. All those are great ways to show your recognition and appreciation for volunteers. And then it goes down to things that are a bit more expensive, but they also show great gratitude. For example, taking them to lunch or. As I scroll down even further, I did dedicate a section to talking about different generations of volunteers and how they like to be recognized. So what we find at Second Harvest is that a lot of times everyone doesn't like the big award ceremony and being recognized in that way, and that's more millennial. Surprising them with coffee or cake, things like that, and to make sure that you are consistently recognizing your volunteers to make sure that happens. And if you're going to work on any capacity to develop a volunteer recognition plan or update a current plan. So, for example, Volunteer Appreciation Week, which this year falls between April 6th and April 13th, where you dedicate an entire week to recognizing your volunteers. So that week you can plan to have snacks or have award ceremonies, things like that. You can also plan to do yearly dinners or Christmas cards if you decide to send out any holiday cards, or if you decide to send out monthly reports or thank you emails. So that all goes into planning and volunteer recognition. What are you going to do each year to recognize your volunteers? Improvements need to be made. So Section 10 focuses on program evaluation. So it kind of walks you through what questions to ask. And some of the resources that I provided were exit questionnaires and surveys, which I think are really good tools in really doing program evaluation. So exit questionnaires are good to do when volunteers leave your program. Whether they leave because there was something they didn't like or it was just their time to go and they have something else that took over time in their life, it's important to kind of give them a questionnaire and ask them what changes were you made. This is where you'll get the most information about your program and see if there are any changes to make. Surveys are also good to use. I think surveys are good to use for volunteers who have been with you for a long time. So maybe after 6 months of at your organization, or maybe 9 months, you can survey them and ask them how is the process going, is there anything that they would like to be changed. Again, all of this information can be used for your purposes to see how you can make changes in your volunteer program. If you're going to do any capacity building efforts in your volunteer program related to program evaluation, you can develop systems and surveys such as I talked about, and there are resources that are on here, or you can develop an advisory committee, a group of volunteers who can sit down and talk about any changes that they would like to see in a volunteer program and also make those changes as well. So lastly, I wanted to click on that last section on it to retaining volunteers. But really retention, what I wanted to end with is that it depends on they're all factors in maintaining volunteers, then they will likely return. So do they have clear expectations and rules? Are they being rewarded? Is it a good climate and setting for them? Are they being welcomed into your organization? Start with this needs assessment and go through and complete the entire volunteer program inventory and then connect with your account specialist and talk about some of your top priorities. The toolkit is also always available online. So I definitely wanted to take how to use the needs assessment and how to use all this information.